Erbelding from Washington is going to give us this paper. Erbelding is a PhD candidate in history at George Mason University and will graduate next year or the next year. Her dissertation focuses on the American response to the Holocaust in 44-45. She received her undergraduate degree in history and in history and American studies from the University of Mary, Washington, and her master's degree in American history from George Mason University. She has been an archivist at the United States Holocaust Memorial for 11 years. And works with new personal papers, papers collections. Through her work at the museum, she was profiled in 2008 in the New Yorker, and has also been seen on the National Geographic and Historic Channel. She's going to talk. She's going to talk on the last phase of the Shoah, in the spring of and summer of 44. The United States Refugee Board, War Refugee Board, initiated various programs to bring about the protection and rescue of Hungarian Jews. I don't think I would read this. It's not necessary.
No.
So go ahead. We have 1 hour.
Okay. Thank you. The first thing I wanted to say is that I recognize that I'm very fortunate in that this conference is in my native language, and I think I'm one of the only people speaking for whom it is my native language. So I have made 10 copies of my talk, of the words of my talk. So if you can pass them, and anyone who would feel more comfortable reading along with me is free to take a copy. The title of my paper is The United States War Refugee Board, the Neutral Nations, and the Holocaust in Hungary. It could also be called Why Was Wallenberg Swedish, which is the title that I got from Ford. Beyond the literal answer of his birth and nationality, the question of why Sweden, among all the neutral nations, sent a representative to Hungary at the behest of the American government is one of the answers I hope to provide this morning. My talk is broken into 2 parts. A short introduction to the War Refugee Board and the extant literature regarding the relationship between the United States and the neutral nations during the war, and a longer discussion of the negotiations between the War Refugee Board and the neutral nations in months after the occupation of Hungary in 1944. There's a major caveat to this sort of approach. As many of you are experts in the Holocaust in your own particular country or in a particular country, I'm a historian of American response, particularly the work of the War Refugee Board. My interpretation of the archival sources, therefore, is from the perspective of Washington looking at Europe. So when I say, for example, that the War Refugee Board made a request of Spain and the Spanish Foreign Office responded in a certain way, I'm not looking at the inner discussions of the Spanish Foreign Office. I'm looking at what Washington knew and how they perceived the work of the neutrals and the perspective of the neutrals. So my approach is broad, encompassing all of the War Refugee Board's requests and reports, but narrow in that I'm taking the information that is provided to them at face value, unless I have some reason to think that they treated the response of Spain as suspicious in some way. I will be using the terms WRB and the board interchangeably with the organization's full name, the War Refugee Board. The War Refugee Board is usually placed in the final chapter or the afterword of books of the United States and the Holocaust, even though it was the official American response to the atrocities in Europe. There's no monograph on the board's operations. My doctoral dissertation, which I'll finish in the spring, attempts to fill that gap. My description of the WRB's work for the purposes of this presentation is quite simplified, therefore I'm at 7 chapters out of 8 and about 600 pages in. So, but I'd be happy to discuss anything I mentioned or anything else about the board in greater detail later on. The War Refugee Board was created due to the conversion of two forces in the United States. In 1943, enough information about the atrocities in Europe had reached the United States and was widely disseminated. Rallies, speeches, and publications called for a dedicated Allied response separate from the general war effort. In November 1943, congressional supporters of an organization called the Emergency Committee to Save the Jews of Europe presented a joint resolution in our House of Representatives and in the Senate, calling on President Roosevelt to create an independent agency dedicated to formulating and implementing programs of relief and rescue. At the same time, the State Department and the Treasury Department were in conflict. The Treasury Department believed the State Department was deliberately delaying the issuance of relief licenses to send aid money into Europe, and also discovered that in February 1943, the State Department had asked the American legation in Bern to cease sending information about the atrocities to the United States. On January 16, 1944, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau and two members of his staff met with Roosevelt to request the State Department be removed from refugee issues, proposing an independent relief agency to handle all matters related to the humanitarian crisis in Nazi-occupied territory. The War Refugee Board was established by a presidential executive order on January 22, 1944. It was meant to solve both the problem of the problem of public demand for the United States to do something, and to address the criticism publicly and internally directed at the State Department. The order read, quote, "It is the policy of this government to take all measures within its power to rescue the victims of enemy oppression who are in imminent danger of death, and otherwise to afford such victims all possible relief and assistance consistent with the successful prosecution of the war." End quote. It was the first time American policy about the humanitarian crisis was defined, and the first time in American history that an independent, non-military government agency was created to provide relief and attempt to rescue non-Americans in an enemy country during wartime. It was an emergency agency authorized only for work in occupied territory. In liberated territory, projects were the domain of the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, which was referenced yesterday several times. That was another outcome of the Bermuda Conference, was the reconstitution of the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, and of UNRWA. The nominal heads of the War Refugee Board were Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau. The staff, however, consisted largely of Treasury Department lawyers who had no expertise in refugee or relief work. John Paley, formerly the head of the Foreign Funds Control Department of the Treasury, which was the department responsible for, among other things, approving the licenses to send relief money, was the first director. Nearly every project related to what we now call the Holocaust, from January 1944 through the end of the war, went through the War Refugee Board. To name a few, unrelated to this presentation, but things that we can talk about later over lunch maybe, the War Refugee Board opened a refugee camp in upstate New York. They were responsible for Roosevelt's statement on atrocities and many of the psychological warfare leaflets and broadcasts sent into Europe in 1944. They dealt with the Joel Brand and the Arbor ransom negotiations and the Museo negotiations. They handled requests to bomb the rail lines leading into Auschwitz. They sent, or tried to send, hundreds of thousands of relief packages into concentration camps through the Red Cross. They issued the text of the Verber Report, the Auschwitz Protocols, to the public, among many, many other things. They also assisted private agencies to send more than $17 million in occupied territory during War Refugee Board's first year. Adjusted for inflation, that's more than $227 million today, or about 179 million euro. As I said, the history of the War Refugee Board tends to be the final chapter in books about American response to the Holocaust. It was criticized, even in 1944, for being too little and too late. In the United States, most non-historians have a tendency to see their country as omnipotent. In the literature of the Holocaust, many scholars have taken advantage of this, writing books entitled "While 6 Million Died," "Why We Watched," "The Abandonment of the Jews," "The Failure to Rescue," and "FDR and the Holocaust, A Breach of Faith." Many of these books promote an idea that is devoid of context, implying that had the United States simply wanted to save the Jews of Europe, it could have done so unilaterally. In this view, the Holocaust occurred because the American government was too anti-Semitic to allow Jewish immigration or to provide the money and means for rescue. Most Americans do not know of the War Refugee Board, and these sorts of books, most of which came out in the 1970s and 1980s, though there are books like this coming out today, it makes sense to place the War Refugee Board as a final, last-minute, half-hearted attempt to do something. There's an alternate narrative of the period, particularly found in the works of scholars such as Ehud Bauer and Richard Breitman, who try to place the United States and Roosevelt within the larger context of organization, bureaucracy, domestic and international politics, and most importantly, the actual war. Many scholars, if they're not scared by the passion of and vitriol of those who promote this view of unilateral American guilt, are beginning to take this nuanced view, but it is an uphill battle. As a further example of American public understanding, there is more than one theatrical play in which Roosevelt is put on trial for the murder of 6 million Jews. It may not surprise you then that there's very little scholarly literature about the relationship between the United States and the neutral nations in regards to the Holocaust. With the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's library at my disposal, I found very few books, most of which were dated or relied on the problematic American sources that I mentioned. I also found a few memoirs of journalists or diplomats who were in various countries during the war, and a few books like David Reeder's recent FDR's Ambassadors that focus on wartime embassies, but not in the neutral nations. The books that do exist discuss diplomacy rather than overseas rescue and relief, which may seem like they should be an identical thing, but after 1944 in the United States, they're not. It's a very important distinction to make. The War Refugee Board is an independent agency separate from the State Department. So projects related to relief and rescue were meant to go through the War Refugee Board, but at times their requests are at odds with what the State Department is asking of neutral nations. With that in mind, looking at the War Refugee Board negotiations with the neutral nations can be very instructive. The board staff was largely completely ignorant of ongoing diplomatic conversations. They did not know or care about wolfram, tungsten, for instance, and had very few preconceived notions about the various neutral countries' ability or willingness to aid refugees. Their requests, therefore, were not cynical or manipulative. They were completely face value requests and were divorced from any other ongoing negotiations between the American embassies and the neutral nations. At times, the board's requests seemed naive or tone deaf, given the relationship between the United States and the Foreign Office of this or that country. But this naivete also gave each neutral the opportunity to control the boards and therefore U.S. perception of their willingness to aid Jews. In the middle of March 1944, German forces occupied Hungary. The War Refugee Board had been in existence for a little less than 2 months. In that time, they had surveyed all the relief organizations in the United States for ideas about fulfilling their mission to provide assistance to Jews and other persecuted minorities. They had cabled all the American embassies and legations overseas to ask about reports about the number and situation of refugees in each country, and to determine each country's willingness to accept any more immigrants who might be liberated from Nazi-occupied Europe. The board had also placed representatives in most of the neutral nations, not Argentina, not Ireland, and some representatives were still getting started, and Hungary was the first immediate crisis that the board encountered. Since it can be confusing to jump from country to country, I'm going to give an overall narrative of the board's reaction to the invasion of Hungary and how each foreign office responded, before explaining the War Refugee Board's presence inside each country and how the Foreign Office responded to these proposals. I will also give a quick summary of other WRB work in each country. Although one of the very first licenses of relief money issued by the new War Refugee Board in January 1944 was for money to encourage escape from Poland into safety in Hungary, the situation changed immediately in March. For the first week of the occupation of Hungary, much of the information the WRB received was from newspaper reports and columns. Reporters anticipated the Jewish persecutions in Hungary would follow the same lines as in other countries, and they were right. The legation learned about economic deprivation, the new political personalities who were installed in the Hungarian government, where Jews were being concentrated, and in what numbers. Relief organizations pleaded for increased broadcasts into Hungary to remind potential perpetrators of post-war justice, for the Red Cross to increase their representation there. At one point, the Red Cross had one person in Hungary at the time. And for protected papers to be handed out to Hungarian Jews. Alan Dulles of the OSS confirmed to the Bern legation staff on May 18th that negotiations between Hungarian and German railway authorities had concluded plans to ship 300,000 Hungarian Jews to Poland, which was information he received from the Hungarian minister to Bern, who was an OSS informant. The board struggled to get reliable information from Hungary. In a memo written immediately after the occupation, board staff wrote, quote, "There is general agreement among those who know the situation in Hungary that it is impossible to help out of Hungary its 800,000 Hungarian Jews and 100,000 foreign Jews, who until March 20th found tolerable and secure refuge there, or any substantial number of them. There will only be a few, certainly not many thousands, who may brave the danger and risks of flight. Therefore, action for the rescue of Hungarian Jews must be directed to their support within Hungary and the improvement of their chance for survival there." End quote. Unable to place American personnel in Hungary, the board had 5 main requests over the spring and summer, identical requests, mostly identically worded, each made to Portugal, Spain, Turkey, Switzerland, and Sweden. The board wanted neutral countries to 1, send any information they had about the situation in Hungary, 2, warn Hungary against new persecutions or against collaborating with German persecutions, 3, add personnel to their diplomatic legations and spread this personnel throughout the country to act as either deterrents or witnesses to persecution, 4, agree to take any Hungarian Jews who would be released due to the acceptance of the Horthy offer, which is something I'll explain in a few minutes, and 5, advise enemy governments that American visas were available to anyone with close relatives in the United States. Of course, each country, particularly Switzerland, as the protecting power of the United States, was asked for additional measures, but these 5 identical requests were made each neutral. I will start with Portugal, since Portugal was the first country the WRB approached about Hungary. The War Refugee Board representative in Lisbon was a man named Robert Dexter, who had been with the Unitarian Service Committee Relief Organization. The board wanted representatives who were not affiliated with the Jewish organizations due to the rivalry between especially the Joint and World Jewish Congress, especially in Lisbon. Dexter was not a particularly effective representative. He had very little creativity and blatantly favored the World Jewish Congress over the Joint, which became a problem, especially since the Joint had all the money. The ambassador to Portugal was R. Henry Norweb, a fairly innocuous career diplomat. On April 12th, the War Refugee Board asked Portugal to warn Hungary that any action meant to inflict new or further persecutions or to continue existing persecutions or deportations would be considered by the United States with the greatest disfavor and would be taken into account at the end of the war. 6 days later, Norweb reported this was done. On May 23rd, the WRB reported that they were, quote, "gravely concerned by reports of measures looking to the mass extermination of Jews in Hungary," end quote, and asked the Portuguese Foreign Office to, quote, "obtain as speedily as possible detailed information from the Portuguese mission in Budapest concerning treatment of the Jews in Hungary," end quote. Just 2 days later, after the United States learned that mass deportations in Hungary had begun, the State Department sent another cable asking Portugal to increase diplomatic representation. Quote, "The lives of 800,000 human beings in Hungary may well depend on restraint that may result from the presence in that country of the largest possible number of foreign observers," end quote. Ambassador Norweb reported back that he had asked for information about Hungary in view of the humanitarian crisis, but did not feel it wise to transmit the request about more personnel. This was an example of the State Department and the War Refugee Board making separate requests to the Portuguese Foreign Office. Norweb stated that asking for an increase in diplomatic representation would be, quote, "impolitic and perhaps prejudicial to the favorable attitude which exists here at present with respect to the refugees' reception. As a result of having made fairly strong representations following the invasion of Hungary, seeking to persuade the government of Portugal not to recognize the puppet regime in Budapest, we find ourselves in an awkward position of which the WRB may not have been aware," end quote. The WRB recognized the potential embarrassment of simultaneously requesting Portugal not to recognize the Hungarian regime and also increase their diplomatic corps there, and so they let the matter drop. On July 19, 1944, the War Refugee Board staff read about the Horthy offer in a 2-sentence news article in the New York Times. The article read in its entirety, quote, Admiral Nicholas Horthy, Regent of Hungary, has promised the International Red Cross Committee that no more Jews will be transported forcibly out of Hungary, it was learned today, and authorized the committee to direct evacuation of Jewish children to countries willing to receive them. A private informant said Admiral Horthy also authorized the committee to remove any Jews possessing visas to Palestine, end quote. The Portuguese Foreign Office, in keeping with the WRB's earlier request for information, passed intelligence onto the embassy, and Ambassador Norweb was able to cable details about the offer a week before the WRB received official confirmation from Bern. The Hungarian government was willing to accede to requests made by various groups. The Swedish government's request to allow the departure for Sweden or Palestine of all Jews with relatives or business connections in Sweden. The Swiss request on behalf of the British for immigration to Palestine of all with Palestine certificates. And the Swiss request on behalf of the War Refugee Board for Red Cross aid in all camps and ghettos, and for the immigration to Palestine of all Jewish children under the age of 10. Horthy also announced the suspension of the deportation of all Jews from Hungary. Even before they could confirm Horthy's offer, the WRB sent cables to all the neutral legations with a 2-part request. First, all people in occupied territory who had received American visas after July 1, 1941, but had been unable to use them prior to the outbreak of war, could receive new visas. Portuguese legations in enemy countries were asked to aid any people who might be in that situation. The second request was much bigger. Should any Hungarian Jews be released through the Horthy offer, the embassy should ask Portugal to receive, house, and feed them until they could be evacuated further. The United States guaranteed maintenance, paying for them, for any who would be received. On August 7th, even before the British had decided whether or not to accept the Horthy offer without stipulations, the United States sent another cable to neutral legations. The Portuguese were requested to receive, house, and feed not just Hungarian Jews, but any Jews who were released from enemy territory until they could be evacuated further. In the formal American response to the Horthy offer, the text was clear that the United States would maintain and find havens for anyone the Germans or their collaborators would agree to release. Norweb gave the text of the board's cable to the Portuguese Foreign Office. A few days later, at a meeting with the Portuguese minister to Hungary, Carlos de Sampaio Garrido, Sampaio said that although his country was sympathetic, it would be much easier if refugees arrived in groups no greater than 300 to 400 at a time. Portugal had already expressed an interest in this matter to Hungary and had issued exit visas to groups of Jews whom the Germans were not permitting to leave. Some Hungarian Jews had found refuge at the Portuguese embassy in Budapest. At the end of August, the WRB expanded the program about issuing new immigration visas from people who previously had them to also issuing entry visas to close relatives of American citizens and resident aliens living in the United States. In a complicated series of bureaucratic steps, the WRB compiled names that were sent to Stockholm and to Bern. Lisbon was informed of this program but expressed concern, stating that it was, quote, impossible to admit refugees falling into classifications without more effective guarantees, end quote, meaning that effective guarantees that these people would be quickly removed from Portugal. The United States reiterated a promise of providing maintenance, but evacuation would depend on the demands of wartime transportation. Portugal was cautious, yet generally willing to consider War Refugee Board requests. Lisbon was the site of a lot of tension between the World Jewish Congress and the Joint, especially in regards to the rescue of children from France through Spain. Tension that WRB Representative Dexter's favoritism did not help. Another War Refugee Board staff member had to come to Lisbon to mediate the situation. There were relatively few other board projects through Lisbon, and after France was liberated, there was no need for an office in Portugal, so the WRB office closed on December 1st. Spain was unique among the neutral nations, as there was no official War Refugee Board representative in the country. In early 1943, Ambassador Carlton Hayes, a history professor in civilian life, had become fed up with representatives from numerous relief organizations making repeated requests to his office and to the Spanish Foreign Office. He established the Representation in Spain of American Relief Organizations, through which all requests related to refugees and aid from overseas relief organizations would be funneled. The director was 27-year-old David Blickenstaff, formerly a representative of the Brethren Service Committee and of the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. Blickenstaff's offices were first located at the American Embassy itself, before moving into a separate building nearby. A year later, when the War Refugee Board was created, Ambassador Hayes was not willing to receive a representative dedicated to refugee matters. Blickenstaff was handling things in Madrid just fine, thank you very much. Hayes was also unwilling to allow Blickenstaff to be designated as the WRB's representative, since he felt that things were already working well. The board perceived Ambassador Hayes as a major impediment to any relief and refugee work through Spain. He was unwilling to inform the Spanish Foreign Office of the creation of the War Refugee Board or the statement of American policy. He was unwilling to ask for WRB-funded reception centers to be established on the Spanish border to screen and maintain refugees escaping from France. He was unwilling to alert the Joint Representative in Barcelona, Samuel Sequeira, of a relief license providing him funds to pay passeurs, since Hayes felt this would put Allied airmen escaping over the Pyrenees in danger. And he frequently cabled to express his disapproval of the War Refugee Board programs, stating that, quote, "It has not yet been demonstrated to my satisfaction that the proposed program of the War Refugee Board, without incurring risks which would outweigh the possible humanitarian benefits, could make any substantial contribution towards the rescue of refugees," end quote. After the invasion of Hungary, the WRB requested Hayes to approach the Spanish Foreign Office to ask for information and to have them warn the Hungarian government against atrocities. That was on April 17th. On May 20th, not having heard from Madrid, the board made the request regarding an increase in diplomatic personnel. At the end of May, the American ambassador finally met with the Spanish Foreign Office about Hungary. In his June 1st cabled response, Hayes explained that, happily, Spain's representative in Hungary had reported, quote, "Measures taken by the Germans against the Jews in Hungary have been applied mainly so far to Czech, Polish, and German Jews who have been and are being placed in concentration camps. The Sephardic Jews, with whom the Spanish representative is particularly concerned, are not confined in this matter. Measures of mass extermination have not been reported by him. The situation, which was without doubt dire, could be best described by stating that rumors happily far outstrip the actualities this far. And it was his hope that the German would be sufficiently preoccupied in organizing Hungary for waging war to prevent them from taking steps similar to those taken in Poland," end quote. The Foreign Office promised to make sure Spanish representatives were active and alert to the possibilities of deportations, but Hayes did not pass along a request for an increase in diplomatic personnel, since he felt Spain was trying to distance herself from the new Hungarian government. So, as in Portugal, the American ambassador never asked. In the summer, the War Refugee Board's contact with Spain improved dramatically. There are two reasons for this. First, Carlton Hayes returned to the United States for consultation, and Walton Butterworth, the first consul of the American Embassy in Madrid, began acting in his absence. Second, an American businessman named Danny Heinemann made a trip to Spain and convinced the Marquis de Ferranda to meet with Count Jordana on behalf of the War Refugee Board. At Heinemann's urging, the Marquis presented Jordana with a list of the WRB's unsuccessful attempts to involve Spain in rescue and relief efforts, and asked the Spanish Foreign Office to approach Hayes and offer to participate in these projects. Jordana expressed willingness, but made it clear that the Foreign Office needed to receive a formal request. So the Foreign Office knew of the War Refugee Board programs and were ready when Butterworth passed along almost all the board's requests from back in the spring. In the first month that Hayes was in the United States, Butterworth sent the WRB 19 cables about negotiations with Spain. In the 6 months prior, Hayes had sent a total of 35 cables to the board, almost all of them complaints and refusals. Madrid announced plans to provide visas to Tangier for 500 Hungarian Jewish children, and also proclaimed that they had provided 1,500 visas for Hungarian Jews in Budapest, who would depart for Spain as soon as the Germans would allow exit visas. After Hayes' return, cooperation with the Spanish continued. The American Embassy in Madrid reported that the Spanish were issuing even more letters of protection in Budapest. were warning the Hungarians against atrocities and were willing to issue Spanish entry visas to all people who received American visas or were relatives of Americans, in case this would add any measure of protection. After the Horthy offer was publicized, Butterworth approached the Spanish Foreign Office to request they receive Hungarian Jews released, making this request even before the WRB asked him to do so. Spain reported that their minister in Hungary would grant entry visas to any Jews released, and in doing so, quote, "The Spanish government exhausts all possible steps which it can take in order to arrive at a favorable solution of the mentioned problem, in which it has demonstrated it is placing its greatest interest and will." End quote. In summary, the War Refugee Board saw Spain as a very willing partner regarding refugee relief projects. From the board's perspective, American Ambassador Carlton Hayes was the problem, not Franco's government. And once the board was able to explain their request to the Spanish Foreign Office through Heinemann and Butterworth, the Spanish were willing to cooperate. I think it's clear from all of the discussions that we've had that Spain really took advantage of the fact that the board had no idea of what was happening before 1944. And so Spain was able to project itself as a very willing and helpful partner when we know that it had not been previously. The War Refugee Board was very active in Turkey, and requests related to Hungary took a back seat in comparison to other projects. The board was represented in Turkey by Ira Hirschman, a marketing executive at Bloomingdale's department store in New York City, and later by Herbert Katsky, a former employee of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. The American ambassador was Lawrence Steinhardt, a career diplomat who was very supportive and personally involved in WRB projects and requests. Most of the board's work in Turkey were related to refugees arriving from Romania and Bulgaria. Hirschman and Steinhardt negotiated with the Turkish government to allow ships carrying hundreds of refugees to arrive in Istanbul and depart for Palestine by train. Even though the vast majority of these refugees did not have entry visas and were only given Palestine certificates after arrival in Turkey. In this way, and through the use of trains bringing refugees to Turkey, almost 7,000 people arrived in 1944, compared to 813 in 1943. While most were Romanian, some had escaped Hungary after the occupation of that country. In early May 1944, before the War Refugee Board made any requests to Turkey related to Hungary, Ambassador Steinhardt sent a cable to Washington. Observing that very few Hungarian Jews had arrived in Turkey in the spring, Steinhardt had asked the Foreign Office if the Turkish embassy in Budapest had ceased issuing exit visas. He was informed that, quote, "The Turk consul at Budapest had sent the Foreign Office word that every Jew entering the Turk consulate in Budapest was arrested as soon as he left and transported to an unknown place." End quote. From the start, it was clear that Turkey was not going to be able to do much to assist Hungarian Jews. After the War Refugee Board did make formal requests about obtaining information, warning Hungary against atrocities, and increasing diplomatic representation, the Turkish government was apologetic. But they had good reason why they could not increase their presence in Hungary. Quote, "Hungarian-Turkish relations are virtually non-existent due to the strain resulting from A, the position with which the Turkish government has taken in materially reducing the shipment of strategic materials to Hungary at the request of the British and American governments, and B, the Hungarian government's refusal to allow former Prime Minister Calais, who has taken refuge in the Turkish legation in Budapest, to leave for Turkey as the government of Turkey has requested." End quote. So, like Portugal and Spain, Turkey had distanced herself from the Hungarian government at the request of the American State Department, and could not turn around and increase diplomatic representation at the request of the War Refugee Board. Moreover, Miklos Kálay, the Hungarian Prime Minister deposed after the occupation, was currently being protected with his family within the walls of the Turkish embassy. The Horthy offer came right before Turkey officially left neutrality and joined the Allies in early August 1944. Though the Germans fled Turkey, the Hungarian representatives stayed. Hirschman was able to meet with the Hungarian consul at Ankara directly, who claimed that no Jews in Hungary had been mistreated, but his government would allow the categories of Jews specified in the Horthy offer to leave. The War Refugee Board requested Turkey issue entry visas to all Jews holding Palestine certificates or who had been previously granted American visas. The Secretary General of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs assured Steinhardt that, quote, His government would be glad to take the action requested at once, end quote, and sent instructions to Budapest for the Turkish embassy to grant entry visas to any Hungarian Jew who could provide any kind of Palestine or American papers. Even just a letter from the Jewish agency would suffice. It was difficult for Turkey to provide aid for Hungarian Jews. Between providing sanctuary to Calais and the arrest of Jews visiting the Turkish embassy, the Turkish government did not have enough leverage to warn the Hungarian government against atrocities or to increase their diplomatic representation in Budapest. Turkish willingness to issue entry visas to Hungarian Jews was undermined, as were all War Refugee Board requests of this nature, by the unwillingness of the Germans to see any Jews actually leave. Ambassador Steinhardt had a good relationship with the Turkish Foreign Office and provided the WRB with a realistic picture of the possibilities of Turkish aid. The board staff trusted his judgment, and relief and rescue through Turkey was therefore quite successful, just not for the reasons stated when it came to Hungary. The War Refugee Board was in almost daily contact with the Swiss Foreign Office. As the protecting power of the United States, Switzerland was the official representative of American interests in Germany and in Hungary. She was also the representative of the interests of most of the Central and South American countries in regards to Germany, most of whom had turned over refugee matters to the United States. So, if Ambassador Leland Harrison, or War Refugee Board Representative Roswell McClelland, formerly of the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, had to pass on any information or any request about Erbelding protective papers, the willingness of Chile to participate in prisoner exchange, or the hope that the Swiss would visit internees in Dresdenstadt, it all went from their delegation to the Swiss Foreign Office. The Swiss received people released from concentration camps as a result of ransom negotiations. They added people with ad hoc South American protected papers to a prisoner exchange to demonstrate the legitimacy of these papers, and transmitted many, many formal protests to the German government. After the occupation of Hungary, these protests increased significantly. Among many other messages, the Bern legation transmitted some of the same requests that the WRB sent to all neutral nations. The board asked Switzerland on May 23rd to pass on any information received from their legation in Budapest. This was done, and although McClelland received far more information from his underground channels, the Swiss Foreign Office specifically provided information about the importance of papers placing Hungarian Jews under the protection of neutral embassies. After the Swiss reminded the War Refugee Board that many South American nations had not designated a protecting power for Hungary, and they would therefore be unable to act with people with Argentinian protected papers or Uruguayan protected papers if they were residing in Hungary. The WRB urged all of these nations to designate Switzerland as the protecting power, and most countries were able to do this successfully, although there were some issues with Ecuador. This brought more Hungarian Jews on false or unverified papers under the protection of Switzerland. Also, in keeping with the role of protecting power, the Swiss transmitted formal messages on behalf of the War Refugee Board, warning against deportations and atrocities and threatening post-war punishment. The War Refugee Board also requested the Hungarian government officially state their intentions regarding the fate of the Jewish community. In early June 1944, the Bern legation did ask Switzerland to increase diplomatic representation in Hungary. In a meeting with legation staff, Emil Desang of the Swiss Foreign Office offered to explore the situation and the suggestion, but gave 3 reasons why it was not likely to happen. It would jeopardize Swiss representation of American interests in Hungary. As protecting power, the Swiss were unwilling to do anything that might be construed by the Hungarians or the Germans as espionage. And once people were arrested in Hungary, they were under the jurisdiction of the Gestapo, so any approaches to the German or Hungarian Foreign Office would be useless. Ambassador Harrison was satisfied, telling the War Refugee Board that, quote, "I'm convinced that the Swiss have done and will conscientiously continue to do all they feel they can do without compromising their position and endangering their usefulness. They have always accorded sympathetic consideration to all proposals, whether or not they have felt able to undertake action," end quote. Even without increasing representation, the Swiss received almost daily requests from the United States, including the request that became part of the Horthy offer, for the Red Cross to be allowed to inspect concentration camps and ghettos in Hungary, and for the release of all Jewish children under 10 so they could go to Palestine. As I said, the Swiss Foreign Office was particularly involved in the protected paper scheme, as it was her responsibility to actually protect anyone granted American papers, including the people with expired American visas, relatives of American citizens and resident aliens, and all the other names the WRB transmitted via numerous cables of lengthy lists. The Swiss also agreed to receive Hungarian Jews in Switzerland, provided the United States arranged for their maintenance and removal as soon as possible for havens elsewhere. For example, in October 1944, a rumor spread in Bern that 8,000 Hungarian Jews were about to show up on the Swiss border. In a matter of days, the Swiss had figured out how to deal with the entry of refugees, and the United States had already figured out the logistics of removing them. The rumored 8,000 never arrived. By mid-October, and the Eurocross takeover of Hungary, the WRB was out of suggestions. They still sent lists of names for the Swiss to transmit to Hungary, but it was clear that no one was going to be allowed to leave. Budapest would have to be liberated. In a memo to Ambassador Harrison, Roswell McClellan wrote, quote, "I do not see just what steps could be taken either by ourselves, other than continued propaganda pressure via the radio or leaflets, or by the Swiss to avert or mitigate this final and radical solving of the so-called Jewish problem. From conversations I had this morning, I have the feeling the Swiss would be willing to do all they could do through their legation in Budapest if they knew exactly how to proceed." End quote. To the War Refugee Board, Switzerland was undeniably the most influential neutral nation. Though the Foreign Office's insistence on strict neutrality was sometimes frustrating, particularly in December 1944, when the Swiss actually refused to transmit several War Refugee Board messages due to the harsh language they were using, the board knew that this neutrality was what guaranteed protection and allowed for continued negotiations with the Germans and Hungarians to ease the plight of those persecuted. Of all the neutral countries, Sweden was the most receptive to War Refugee Board requests. Unhampered by protecting power concerns, the Swedish Foreign Office seemed to take the position, summarized in the Svenska Dagbladet in July 1944, that, quote, "all neutrality ceases to exist in face of these deliberate and cold-blooded crimes against defenseless and innocent people," end quote. Ivor Olsen, the War Refugee Board's representative, had 3 jobs in Sweden. He was a Treasury Department staff member who was in Sweden to report on Swedish-German commercial trade. He was the board's representative, and he was an OSS agent. Ambassador Herschel Johnson was not as involved in refugee matters as, say, Lawrence Steinhardt in Turkey, but he still actively supported Olsen's efforts. Olsen spent most of his time working with relief agency representatives in Sweden, who urged relief packages be sent to concentration camps, and for Sweden to lend boats for refugee transport between Romania and Turkey, or to assist with people escaping from various areas. Olsen also supported the rescue efforts of the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian labor groups, who used small fishing and motorboats to transport refugees. Though these efforts in the summer of 1944 resulted in the arrival of Stockholm of 1,000 or so Baltic refugees, none of them were Jewish. In late May 1944, after the War Refugee Board asked Sweden to pass along any information about the situation in Budapest, to warn Hungary, and to increase diplomatic representation, all 3 suggestions were immediately accepted. Sweden became one of the most valuable sources of information about Hungary. The Swedish Foreign Office provided the War Refugee Board with a detailed report from their embassy of what they were witnessing on the ground in Budapest, including demographic data, information about new legal restrictions, and the kinds of relief supplies needed most. Later in the summer, Olsen met with a newly returned embassy worker who revealed that he had witnessed Hungarian police actively assisting in the deportations from the brickyards. The War Refugee Board used this information as the basis of a formal protest through Switzerland. In addition to just passing on information, the Swedish Foreign Office sent suggestions to the War Refugee Board of ways to better implement their programs, from offering to take all Hungarian Jewish women and children and care for them in Sweden for up to 3 years, to reminding the board that Sweden was the protecting power for Iran, and if the U.S. could convince Iran to make a formal request, they would issue Iranian protected papers in Budapest. After the board asked Sweden to increase diplomatic representation, they heard less than a week later that a Swedish businessman, already planning a trip to Hungary, might be willing to act in that capacity. A week after that, Raoul Wallenberg, having shed his supposed business obligations, or so the War Refugee Board thought, was officially selected. He arrived in Budapest in early July 1944, formally attached to the Swedish embassy, but tasked with working on War Refugee Board programs. Ambassador Johnson wrote to the board in Washington to ask them to send Wallenberg instructions, as the Swedish Foreign Office, quote, in making this assignment, feels it has cooperated fully in lending all possible facilities for the furtherance of an American program. The newly designated attaché, Raoul Wallenberg, feels that he is in effect carrying out a humanitarian mission in behalf of the War Refugee Board. Consequently, he would like full instructions as to the line of activities he is authorized to carry out, and assurances of adequate financial support for these activities, so that he will be in a position to develop fully all local possibilities. End quote. After the cessation of deportations from Hungary and the Horthy offer, which undoubtedly happened in part because of appeals made by the King of Sweden to Horthy, Sweden expressed willingness to accept various categories of Hungarian Jews, particularly those with some sort of tie to Sweden. The Swedish Foreign Office also received copies of the War Refugee Board lists of people with expired visas and relatives of Americans, but did not pass on these lists to the Hungarian or German authorities. There had not been a courier between Sweden and Hungary at that point for over 2 months, and the names would have to be cabled. The Foreign Office feared this would also only confuse the situation in Budapest, where the Swedish legation already had more than 15,000 people under protection. And, as Ambassador Johnson explained to the board, quote, Swedish officials further feel that no practical value is to be derived by presenting lists, inasmuch as the Swedish legation in Budapest stands ready to aid all Jews who apply. End quote. After the Eurocross takeover, the situation grew more difficult for the Swedish legation in Budapest and for the legations of all neutral nations. Spain's representation fled in December, placing Jews under Spanish protection in the care of Sweden. The Swedish legation reported that her workers were being molested on the streets, their property stolen, and people in danger of being killed. 4 diplomats had been dismissed from the Hungarian embassy in Stockholm. Sweden told the board they contemplated keeping them as hostages to ensure the safety of Swedish diplomats in Budapest. At the end of December 1944, Ambassador Johnson reported that the Swedish Foreign Office had lost touch with her embassy in Budapest. The next message the board received through the Swedish legation was on January 20th, 1945. The cable was reassuring at the time, terrible in retrospect. It read, quote, Swedish representative in Hungary Wallenberg is safe and sound in that part of Budapest occupied by the Russians. End quote. In conclusion, it is instructive to compare the ways in which the neutral nations responded to War Refugee Board requests. Whether they could act out of humanitarian concern or were unable to due to pragmatic considerations, it's clear that all the countries seriously considered the board's proposals related to Hungary. No neutral country dismissed them outright. It is equally clear that the United States did not and could not act unilaterally to save Hungarian Jews or the persecuted people of any nationality, Jewish or not. The board's partnership with neutral nations, sometimes acting with and sometimes acting through these other nations, was crucial to any rescue or relief successes. These relationships have been virtually ignored in the scholarship of the Holocaust, and I'm pleased to be able to participate in this conference to begin to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. This was real interesting. But we only have 5 minutes.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's the other side.
We can talk around lunch.
We can talk around lunch. Okay. Okay, let's start with the
Yes, let's start with the food hour.
Let's hear.
Well, thank you very much. You have saved me about 15 minutes of my address this evening. It's very important to have a PhD written about this, but as you said yourself, it's extremely limited because there is no general vision of where this is placed within the Holocaust generally. And you have to, when you do a thing like that, inevitably, to ignore the movement of the war, so to speak. Wallenberg is Paul can tell all of us, because he's the person who's written about this. Was basically an OSS nomination, because I also was Norwegian originally, who was an OSS man, and the WRB was an excellent cover for his intelligence very little about the communications that we managed to get to Switzerland, which was the obvious thing. So the War Refugee Board was very, had tremendous goodwill, did everything it could, was totally ineffective. When I interviewed John Pedder, when I was young and beautiful, he, by the way, refused to be recorded on tape and didn't even permit me to write down what he was telling me. This was the impression I got. This was a man who did everything he could have done, really. I mean, any idea that came along, he tried. Totally ineffective. And so this whole business of this contemporary historical debate, the WRB telling the world after the war that it rescued 400,000 Jews, is sheer and absolute nonsense. And people publish articles and books about it. So we only have 5 minutes, so I'll stop there and I'll say a few things about that in the evening. But all is the authority from Parliament.
What about hearing Paul for? Okay.
Rebecca, thank you very much for an extremely detailed, professional, illuminating presentation of yours. There's so much I could say about Wallenberg and Budapest, some of which we agree about, some of which we don't agree about, as we discovered the other evening. But I do want to say, with regard to Wallenberg, the tragedy of Wallenberg, his disappearance. The Swedish government, it is the greatest scandal in modern Swedish history. The failure of the Swedish government to do virtually anything in between 45 and 47 to get him back. And those of you who do not know, the Wallenbergs are the Swedish Rockefellers. The Wallenbergs controlled the Swedish economy in many ways. They could have gotten anything they wanted out of the government had Marcus and Jakob chosen. The problem with the interpretation that Wallenberg was an American agent, which I say he was not. He was a Swedish ad hoc diplomat in the tradition of using Wallenbergs in the foreign ministry. Both Jakob and Marcus, his older cousins, had also diplomatic missions during the war. The Swedish government, in 2 official reports, 2001, 2006, have used this notion that he's an American representative to justify their failures to do anything to get him back. And this is a very problematic interpretation, I would say. We're talking memory now, not what happened in Budapest. There's a very important distinction, of course. But the Swedish government, over the decades, and in the Eliasson report of 2006, basically said, we're not to blame for not getting our guy back because he was an American agent.
I agree with you completely on that, especially since the United States did not know he disappeared for about 2 months. So there's 2 months where he's missing, and the Swedes know it, and the Americans do not.
But what's interesting is the other Swedish diplomats, Per Unger, Danielsson, the 2 women, Bauer, and they were also detained by the Russians. And they took the exact same route from Bucharest, Kiev, into Moscow. When they were in Moscow, they got to visit the ambassador in Moscow. Wallenberg was kept quiet. Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat on a Swedish mission assisted by the Americans, and the Swedes have systematically used the American angle to escape responsibility for their failure to get this guy back.
Yeah, this is one of the things that my project, it's a little difficult to get into. Wallenberg and the bombing of Auschwitz and things like that are actually a very small percentage of what the War Refugee Board is doing. They loom very large in the historical memory, but in terms of the amount of effort, the amount of time they actually spend on either of these things, it's very small. Wallenberg sends maybe 6 reports back from July to December 1944 that they received. their understanding is that he is working on an American mission. And so because I'm looking at the world from Washington, in October 1944, he writes a letter that gets sent from Ivor Olson that says, as part of my duties, and in that way I mean yours, we have assisted in saving the lives of hundreds of people. So they receive that, and between that and Herschel Johnson's message, they understand Wallenberg to be a Swedish diplomat attached to the Swedish embassy, but working on their project.